Welcome to Girl Dad, the podcast. I'm your host, Madeline Anderson, and I'm thrilled to bring you honest conversations with dads and daughters, sharing heartfelt stories, actionable advice, and real daughter perspectives that will help you be the best girl dad you can be. Hey, and welcome back to Girl Dad, the podcast. I'm your host, Madeline Anderson, and today we are doing a deep dive on The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. You've probably heard me speak about this book before on this podcast, and I think it is a must read. It is so profound. But my goal for this episode is to articulate all the main messages and takeaways from the book so that you don't have to read it, although I would still recommend that you do. But I really want to use this time, and honestly, this will probably be a multi-part episode. I want to use this time to really talk about everything inside the book, what the most important takeaways are, and really what's going on with this shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. Another reason that I wanted to discuss this today is because I just finished a keynote speech this morning at the International Fathering Conference, and this was one of the main topics that I spoke about, and it was really well received. There were about 400 people there, and I had a lot of people coming up to me afterwards saying how interesting this subject is and how important it is to learn about it. So it gave me the right kind of push to say, you know what, this is the perfect time to drop a solo on this. So that's what we'll be doing today. And the theme for this episode will be about what happened to all of the girls in Gen Z and why this happened. Also, for reference, I am technically a Gen Z. I am about a year away from that cusp year where it goes from millennial to Gen Z. And I tried to tell my husband that I'm a zillennial because I don't really relate to either generation. And he said only a Gen Z would say that. So I guess it's true. I am a Gen Z. And I think it's helpful context because I do remember when the iPhone came out. I remember when my friend Jeremy brought it to middle school and everyone was crowding around him like, wait, I want to see. And some people were telling him, oh, I don't like how it doesn't have any buttons and except for the home button. And other people were saying, I don't understand how this works. And it's just kind of funny to look back on that moment and realize, wow, things have really changed so fast since then. And my two younger sisters are also Gen Z. And as I was reading this book, it was really interesting for me to think about how much more each of them were affected because the technology was introduced when they were younger and it became normalized when they were younger. And their brains at that time were more vulnerable and malleable. And the numbers speak for themselves. So really interesting and I think really important to be aware of because we're seeing now the data and it's very clear that there is a direct relationship between the introduction of the smartphone and the decline in mental health for young children and teenagers and middle schoolers. And it's really quite tragic. So again, we're going to go over that data and we're going to kind of talk about why that happened, what's going on behind the hood. And then in another deep dive, we'll get more into specifics on what was really going on with the daughters. So let's get into the numbers. Jonathan Haidt did an amazing job of providing a ton of different data points and lots of graphs that honestly all looked very similar, where you just see depression, anxiety, isolation, self-harm, all these different negative outcomes spike. And they all spike in the time where Gen Z was starting to be in high school, and it just continues to go up, 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 especially for the younger Gen Z. So, for example, depression and anxiety, for when I was in high school, there was a huge spike. But compared to when my littlest sister was in high school, it looks like nothing because it just goes straight up from there. I suppose it's also helpful for me to give you actual numbers instead of trying to describe the slope of a graph without any visuals. So let's go over some key stats from the book. Number one, anxiety rates rose 50 to 100% almost overnight. So levels of anxiety and depression were actually pretty stable for teenagers from the late 1990s all the way through 2012 or 2011 with no signs of a problem. Then all of a sudden in 2012, the numbers went shooting up anywhere from 50 to 100%. So, what happened in 2012? This is when things shifted and smartphones became more mainstream for middle schoolers. So, by this time, 50% of middle schoolers had a smartphone. Number two, rates of major depressive episodes among girls skyrocketed 145% since 2010. Number three, in 2020, 1 in 4 girls were experiencing depression. Number four is a heavy one, and it's the last one. ER visits for self-harm tripled among girls aged 10 to 14 since 2010. And suicide for preteen girls surged 167% in the same period. It breaks my heart to think that these aren't just data points. These are daughters, these are girls in high school and middle school who are experiencing things like depression and anxiety and isolation and overwhelm. And there are clear answers as to why this is the case. So we already talked about the fact that by 2012, 50% of middle schoolers had smartphones. So this is a shift in the culture of what's the norm in terms of the technology that they have in their pockets. Another thing that kind of changed the landscape was that iPhones came out with a forward-facing camera. So now you have a selfie cam, which changed the way that kids were interacting with their phones to taking photos of look at what I'm looking at and look at where I'm at to look at me, look at how I look. And this for women turned into, or young women, girls really, turned into a lot of comparison and judgment and over awareness of what they look like and over obsession as to what they should look like, which we'll get into later. The other thing was there was 4G data widely available for everyone. So if you had a smartphone, you could doom scroll endlessly anytime, anywhere. And before that, you had to be on your computer connected to Wi-Fi, or, have good service. So that was another change that I think really impacted the children at the time. The other main theme that Jonathan Haidt mentions throughout the book is this shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And the issue is that we're not only talking about these additional factors such as, more phones in middle school, more smartphones in middle school, and adding the selfie camera, but we have to think about what it's replacing, right? What are we taking away to add this technology at such a young age? And really what he boils it down to is we're taking away a play-based childhood. And kids aren't playing outside. They're not getting bored. They're not playing with tools. They're not taking risks. They're not figuring out things with other kids, problem solving, understanding, sharing. There's just so many things that you learn through play, creativity, right? So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You're taking away something that's really vital for development, and you're replacing it with something that hurts development. So it's a lose-lose situation. Additionally, when we think about the dangers that kids face throughout childhood, it used to be things like don't talk to strangers or don't take candy from stranger or, the parents are watching out for a white van, right? Well, now you give them a phone and they're in your home, so they're, safe in quotes. But they have access to the entire world and the entire world has access to them. So there's a lot of overprotection in the real world and underprotection online. That is one of Haidt's biggest themes and takeaways that he wants parents to understand is that we need more parameters around online usage of technology, and we need to let the kids go outside and roam and scrape their knees and learn their lessons. Main thing is just even recognizing what's going on here and the patterns that have shaped the way that Gen Z and future generations are more anxious and more depressed. He also talks about this idea of anti-fragility, and he really argues that children are anti-fragile. So they actually need some sort of adversity and challenge early in life in order to handle difficult situations later as adults. So without that kind of challenge and testing and failing and the resilience that is built along the way, they become really prone to things like anxiety and depression because they don't understand how to cope with those things. And going back to, just thinking about the wiring of their brains during this time, their brains are being shifted and altered to be wired a certain way. And we're forgetting this really, really essential part of their wiring, which is that resiliency that sets them up for success in life. This also reminds me of the theme that boredom is essential. I think some of my best, most creative ideas, business ideas have come when I'm the most bored. And that's not just me. That is a very common thing because we are so overstimulated all the time that we're almost in survival mode and we're just filtering out what stimulus is not relevant right now. And we're trying to focus, but we're getting blasted with text messages and notifications and advertisements. And you open a new tab and there's all kinds of things to look at. It's just constant stimulation. And when we're bored and we're sitting with ourselves, we reflect and we download and we love and we feel grateful. And when we replace that feeling of boredom with technology, a phone, and then we scroll, then we're just distracting ourselves further. And we're all guilty of that, right? Even as adults. But the difference is that our brains are already structured and they're already wired a certain way, especially if we've had a play-based childhood, which I feel fortunate to say that my sisters and I, even being Gen Zs, we definitely had a play-based childhood. So when you take a child and you replace any sort of boredom with technology, what you're doing is you're training them to be constantly looking for the next dopamine hit. And what this translates to, or can translate to, is that they become bored really easily and they need something more stimulating. And so, for example, maybe a long, really amazing, heartfelt conversation between a father and a daughter is now boring for the daughter or physically uncomfortable. She doesn't know how to manage that kind of conversation because she's used to just scrolling TikTok and every 2 seconds listening to something new, right? So I know I just gave you a lot of statistics, scary statistics, and reasons for those statistics, and just a lot of information in general. But I do want to take a moment to recognize that dads have no roadmaps for this kind of thing and have had none, especially during the time where we were growing up as Gen Z and there was no information because we're kind of the guinea pigs, right? Like, who would have thought that depression and anxiety would go through the roof? It makes sense now looking back, of course, but hindsight is 2020. And for any dad who is listening to this and has raised their daughters and maybe wishes they didn't use as much technology or wishes that they had conversations earlier, control what you can control, right? Like everything in the past has already happened. So let's talk about what you can do moving forward and provide some solutions for how to support your daughter in navigating this tech heavy world that she's living in that changes every day. And let's make sure that this is positive and uplifting and not something that is putting you down because I never want that. That is not how I operate on this podcast. My goal is always to be a cheerleader for girl dads and uplift you to support your daughters, not to put you down for doing something wrong, especially because we are all always operating with all available information that we have at that time. And with this kind of a thing, there's more technology and more information coming out every single day. So let's all do our best to take action moving forward starting now. Number one, do a family audit. This is a great place to start so that you kind of understand the landscape of how much your family is using technology and how they're using it. So just observe for a week, how much of your daughter's social life is on her phone versus in person. So is she texting her friends, Snapchatting her friends, or is she hanging out with her friends in person? And when she does come home from school, does she go to her room and is she on her phone? Or is she hanging out in the living room, socializing? And what are her favorite apps that she's using? Is she on social media? These are things just to, again, take note of Do a family audit. Do it for yourself too. Understand how much technology you're using. Look at your screen time on your phone and see which apps you use the most. It can be really shocking to see just how much you're on your phone if you don't put time limits on. I'm a big fan of the time limits, even just for awareness, because that's, again, what this step is about. Just be aware of tech use across the board as a family. Number 2, depending on how old she is, reframe what keeping her safe actually means. Haidt recommends more time playing outside, playing sports. Yes, you might fall down and hurt yourself, but the dangers of being online are greater. And in today's world, understanding how she's spending time online, what apps she's using, who she's communicating with, if she's communicating, can be the best form of safety. Number 3, start the conversation with your daughter about technology and make sure this isn't a lecture. This is just an open-hearted, open-minded conversation with genuine curiosity and zero judgment. And really, you just want to know what's going on from her perspective. So, what apps does she use the most? What does she love about them? What stresses her out? And maybe even how is she using AI? If you listen to the episode with Wit, it was not the last episode, but the one before, which got a lot of great feedback. If you haven't already listened to it, I would recommend it. But he talked a lot about navigating this world of AI that's changing every single day. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that he gave is to have a conversation with your daughter about it, because you don't realize what's going on in her head and what's stressing her out. And her experience isn't always like, oh, I love technology, I want to use it as much as possible, even if what you see and what you observe is, oh, my daughter uses it all the time. A lot of children are feeling really addicted, really stressed out about their usage of technology. And he even talks about how teenagers are adding errors in their essays to make sure that their teacher doesn't think they're using AI when they're not. So this is a confusing time for children to grow up in as well. And I think reducing blame on yourself, reducing blame on your daughters, reducing blame on the family is the best way to go about this. This is something that we're all trying to figure out. And I love the way that Jonathan Haidt navigates this landscape and provides advice accordingly. But at the end of the day, it's new to all of us. And it's an important topic to just be aware of and have conversations with your children about it. The last piece of advice is to rethink boredom. We talked about this already, but really just pushing back on that reflex when you're bored and you want to pick up your phone and encouraging your daughter to do the same. If you're bored, let yourself be bored. Put your phone in another room. Have boundaries around technology, like, for example, no tech at the dinner table. Boredom is not a problem to solve. It's where creativity and self-reflection and resilience are built. So let her be bored. Encourage boredom. And if she is going to do something interesting, hand her a journal and a pen. A lot of amazing insights and peace and things that help prevent anxiety and depression can be found in journaling and sitting down and relaxing and not constantly fulfilling this need to not be bored. That's really all I wanted to cover today. I do not want to overwhelm you with all of this information. I know it is a lot, but I think it's really important. And the main takeaway for this episode specifically is to not blame yourself and to not blame your daughters and really to not even blame the phones. It's just understanding this ever-changing landscape, understanding what smartphone usage can do to children, especially daughters, and take action to make today better than yesterday and tomorrow better than today. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in today. Please make sure you are subscribed and go make it a great day. Thank you for tuning in to Girl Dad, the podcast. If you found today's conversation helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a fellow girl dad. I read every review and truly take your words to heart. To close out, remember, your intentional moments make lasting legacies. See you next week.